Good evening. Juan, forgiveness abounds, because I think if you've ever been asked to serve during the worship, you've had that moment. I remember having it for the first time when I was in 10th grade. We went to Louisville. I was sitting with my friends because we had our group of guys that all sat together, and I sat there for felt like 10 minutes going, man, who has this prayer? As someone got up to do it, I said, I have the prayer, right? And so anyway, I remember it vividly. The funniest part of it, though, is that Juan looked at me and said, is this your turn? Are you up? Listen, this is what being a family is all about. We forgive any mistakes, big or small, because that's what our God does. So let's begin tonight. We're going to be in Exodus for the most part, the book of Exodus. We've got the question tonight, who is God? If someone were to ask you that question, and they said just straight up, who is God? What would your answer be? Would you have an answer for them? I think this question right away is, easy. Well, maybe easy. It's one of those questions that initially you have, well, God is God, and you feel like that's a really simple question. But then as you start to begin to answer it, you realize, well, it's a little bit more complicated than it maybe sounds right at the beginning. And maybe you don't have a clean, quick answer to give. I was running the test on Courtney, and I said, without any context, okay, Court, who is God? And she goes, I don't know, like the creator. And I said, well, that's exactly where my brain went. Yeah, he's the creator, God. And then what? And she goes, I don't know, he's God, which was exactly where my brain went, from he's the creator to, I don't know, God. We know what God is. We know who God is. Like, it's almost an understood. And, if you sit there for long enough and you chew on it long enough, or if you or to try and flesh it out, I'm sure pretty quickly we could come up with a list of things about God that make up who he is. I mean, if you think about it long enough, you know that he's a God who, he is love, right? We think back and we think God is love. We know that he's a God who is forgiving. We know that he is a God who is just. And we know some things about him, but maybe we don't have that easy answer. You notice it seems like a really simple question, but it also seems to have kind of a complex answer. And that makes a little bit of sense, doesn't it? Because while our God is in some ways simple to understand, in other ways he's incredibly complex, right? We serve the creator of all the universe, who is a being outside of our created universe. That in and of itself is going to be difficult to fully understand. And so the question of who is God is a question that we should obviously have an answer to, and yet there is a little bit of understanding that there is some mystery to who God is. If you just dive in and say, hey, who is God? Let's find out. Page 1 of the Bible. Let's read about him. When you dive into Genesis, you notice he's kind of a mysterious God. When you read through the pages of Genesis, if someone were to ask you about Genesis, who's the main character of Genesis? Our answer would be, of which story, right? Because we have Genesis broken down into Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and Noah and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, right? That's how we think of it. And each of those has their own main character, right? Well, but God is the main character of the book of Genesis, but he's kind of mysterious throughout that book. He doesn't necessarily stand there in your face throughout Genesis. He actually says this about himself. Look at Exodus chapter 6. Exodus chapter 6, God's talking to Moses. And look at verse 3. Well, let's do verse 2. God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty, but by my name, the Lord, I did not make myself known to them, right? So God actually says, listen, in Genesis with the patriarchs, I was a little bit mysterious. I did not fully reveal myself. In one sense, I didn't tell them my name. I revealed myself to them, he says, appeared to them as God Almighty. The name that we usually have associated with that is El Shaddai. And so I can't say that name anymore without singing the song El Shaddai. We had to learn that one for the recording. But that's the name that God says he appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as. And so he kind of is telling Moses, listen, throughout the time of the patriarchs, I did not reveal myself fully to these men. I was a bit mysterious through Genesis, and really that tracks. When you read through Genesis, you very much get lost thinking that God is not in the story, even in stories like Joseph. Like when you read through Joseph's story, like we know God is always there. And when we get to the end of the story, Joseph says for us, you guys meant this for evil, but God used it for good. And he gives us kind of the, hey, God has always been here all throughout all of this stuff. And we know that, but God does not do the things in Genesis after like chapter 6, 7, 11. It really once Abraham comes onto the scene, God is not as active in Genesis as he is in Exodus. And you see this come up in the way that people describe him. When you read through the book of Genesis in chapter 1 and chapter 2, where we have the creation accounts, God is described, or he's named Elohim, right? El or Elohim. That's the name that is given to God. Now, what's really funny about that is best translated to our word, God, because the word God is not actually a name, right? For us, it's the name of our God. He is God. And we have turned that title of God into a name somewhat in a way to say there really aren't any other gods. So to call him anything, to call anyone else God would make no sense. He's the only God, therefore he is God, almost as if that is his name. You see how that kind of developed? But back at this time, these people were not nearly as monotheistic, right? And so this writing, this language had a phrase, El or Elohim, and that really just meant higher spiritual being. And so Genesis 1 and 2, that's how God is described. That's the name given to him. Elohim, God, right? And so God created. So we don't have a name for God in the beginning, but we do have a description. He is a separate, powerful, spiritual being. Then as you read through, you see some titles that are given to God throughout Genesis. You might think of Hagar. I think she comes first. Hagar comes first, and when she's off in the wilderness after Abraham and Sarah made their horrible mistake, Hagar becomes pregnant. She runs off into the wilderness, and she is in the wilderness, vulnerable, likely going to die, and God provides for her. She gives God a name, and it sounds like a name, right? She gives him a description, really. She says, you're a God of seeing, a God who sees me, right? And so that's kind of a name for God. I think it's really cool that God did not say, that's not my name, right? God didn't stop her and say, no. Listen, this is who I really am, because there is a lot of truth in what Hagar said about God. He is a God who sees the oppressed and who sees the hurting. And that's what she says. That's the name Hagar gives to God. A couple chapters later, Abraham also gives that name to God. He also gives that name to God. I believe it's right after he nearly sacrifices Isaac. He says, you're a God of seeing, a God who sees us. And the idea here is a God who is providing for us in that context. And so you see people give him names. You may think of others that come to your mind. The God of hosts, God Almighty, El Shaddai, like we said. These are all names that are given to God throughout Genesis. But none of these are his name. These are just descriptions. And they're important and they're beautiful and they tell us some about who God is, but they don't tell us who God is. And there's an important distinction there. Then we get to the story of the Exodus. And so when we ask the question, who is God, this is really where we have to start. Look at Exodus chapter 3. Exodus chapter 3. So we've got a lot of descriptions about God, but he's a bit of a mysterious God throughout Genesis. Then we have the Exodus that begins with a people who seems like they've forgotten God and a king who absolutely has forgotten these people's God. You remember the Pharaoh arose who did not remember Joseph. He dealt harshly with these people because he was afraid of them. Moses is born, he's delivered, and then he ultimately kills a man, runs away, and then is brought up in Jethro's house as he's tending Jethro's flock we have the account in Exodus chapter 3 of the burning bush, or the not burning bush, because it didn't burn. The on-fire bush. I tried to describe that to Bonnie. I said, well, the bush was on fire, but it wasn't hot. That was the best way I could think to describe that to a 3-year-old. So this is what we've got, the Moses and God at the bush that was on fire. Let's start reading in, we just start here at the beginning of the chapter. It says, now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the west side of the wilderness, and he came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. Then he said, do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now, that was a lot of description instead of a name, wasn't it? That's kind of interesting. You get to this point, and a voice is calling to you from a bush, says, take off your shoes, you're on holy ground. I am. We would have all said our names. God decides to say some history. I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And what he's doing here is he is activating that promise that these people have heard and grown up knowing their whole life. That promise made to Abraham, I'm the one who made that promise. All right? And so then Moses, at the end of the verse here, and Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Oh man, this is just on the fly here, but that's a really interesting verse when you get to the other side of the Exodus, the other side of the Red Sea, and Moses asks to see God. Talk about a changed man. I think we talked about that recently. Verse 7, then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings. Right? He's a God who sees. And I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children out of Egypt? Right? So Moses, and I actually don't know if we've ever studied this in depth, but Moses gives a number of excuses here. And the very first issue is, who am I to do this? I am no one important. I'm no one special. You may think of the things on Moses' mind. I wasn't even brought up as an Israelite, right? I was brought up in an Egyptian household. I killed a guy and had to be on the run for my life. I have a warrant out for my arrest in Egypt. I mean, who am I to do this? You could probably pick somebody better. That's his first question, who am I? And then God responds, he said, but I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. I love that God gives him a sign for after he's done, right? If you go do this, at the end, you're going to serve me on this mountain. That will show you that I'm with you, which doesn't help me now, God. I need something now. And it's awesome that God knows that and gives him a sign later in the passage. Then Moses says to God, verse 13, so excuse number 1, who am I? Excuse number 2, then Moses said to God, okay, hypothetical here. If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? You can almost see Moses reaching here, because when God introduced himself, Moses didn't wonder who he was, right? I think if Moses came to the people and just said, hey, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob sent me, I think they would have said, okay, right? I think they would have probably been at least understood the time and score. They wouldn't have needed clarification on that. Because like we said, God didn't reveal himself to them by a name yet. This is how they would have known this God, as El Shaddai or God Almighty. So when Moses asks this question, you really see him looking. He's really looking for his out. All right, I don't even know your name. You don't really need to know my name, right? But what does God do? Now, this is really important because what God does right here is unique to our God. He says, God, verse 14, God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. Listen, did you know God tells us his name? I think it's pretty awesome that while we have some people describe God or ascribe names to God throughout Genesis, when we get to Exodus, God uses his own mouth to tell us who he really is. This is my name. I am who I am. That's awesome. That's awesome. He says this to Moses, and he describes himself as existence. You remember growing up in language arts? They call it ELA now, I found out. English Language Arts, ELA. So growing up in language arts or English class, you would learn about be verbs. Do you remember the be verbs? Am, is, are, was, were, be, being, been. You remember those? All right? Those are the verbs that are about a state of being. God's like, I'm those. That's my name. I am be verbs. I am existence. I'm life. I am who I am. I am yesterday, today, and tomorrow. I am life itself. That's what God is telling Moses. My name is life. My name is existence. In fact, I am the giver of life and the sustainer of life. This is who God is telling Moses that he is. It's a really significant thing, especially in this culture, to have a name that has meaning. I'm sure you remember the story of Abraham and Sarah when they were going to have a child. What was his name? It was going to be Isaac. Why? Well, because both of them laughed when they heard they were going to have a child, and so they were going to have a kid, and his name was going to be Laughter, right? And so names in this culture, and that's one of many examples, names in this culture were very significant. A name meant something. And so when God tells Moses his name, it's not some arbitrary, well, this is my name. This is an element of who God is. He is life. He is the sustainer, the giver, and he is the creator of life. He is, which is where that translation, I am, is really beautiful. The Hebrew word here is Yahweh. When I was teaching this to the kids a while back at our retreat, I told them, if you hear the name Yahweh or Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, if you hear it pronounced in a more Hebrew way, or if you hear the name Jehovah, those are all references to this time, this name that God tells Moses. And so we serve a God who told us his name. That's awesome. A couple more excuses. We're not going to finish the rest of this chapter. We're going to skip to Exodus chapter 8. Exodus chapter 8. Moses comes before Pharaoh. He tells him what God has said, and then we have the most famous thing that Exodus is known for, and rightfully so in a lot of ways, the 10 plagues. So Moses comes before Pharaoh, says, let my people go. Hey, what did Pharaoh say? No, you're all supposed to yell it. The kids do it every time, right? He says, let my people go. Pharaoh says no. And then the 10 plagues come, and God sends all 10 of these plagues. We've talked about this before, but just a quick refresher. Each of these plagues in the 10 plagues was correlated, they corresponded to an Egyptian god. So in the beginning of Exodus, we learn God's name, and we learn so much about who he is from that name. I am. Beautiful, exciting, awesome that God tells us his name. Then he shows us what he can do, right? In Exodus chapter 8, 9, and 10, we've got the account of the 10 plagues. Each of these plagues corresponds to at least one, if not multiple, Egyptian gods. The water to blood was the assertion of the god of the Nile, as well as others. The plague of frogs was an assertion over the god Hecht. who was supposed to have the head of a frog, a goddess with the head of a frog. The third plague of gnats or lice was an assertion of God's power over the god Geb, who was meant to be the god over the dust of the earth. The fourth plague of flies was an assertion over the god Khepri, who was supposed to have the head of a fly or a beetle. Then the plague number 5, where the livestock died, the cattle died. Hathor was a fertility goddess who was pictured with the head or horns of livestock, of a bull. Plague number 6, boils, where God asserted his power over Isis, who was a goddess of health, and Imhotep, who was the god of healing. Plague number 7, I know we're doing this, is a lot of information, but plague number 7 is the plague of hail, which was God's asserting his authority over Nut, the goddess of the sky, and her father Shu, who is the god of wind and air. Interestingly enough, they were meant to be gods of calming, and God caused hail. Not calm. Plague number 8 is the plague of locusts. That is Nippur and Nipri. They were the god and goddess of grain, and the locusts, when they came, swarmed and devoured the grain. Plague number 9, the plague of darkness, was a direct correlation to Ra, who was the most prominent god in all of Egypt. He was the god of the sun, and our God asserted his power over that god by darkening the sun only in Egypt, but everywhere else the Hebrews had light. And then the 10th plague is the death of the firstborn. This is an example of God showing that he has power over life itself, as well as asserting authority over Pharaoh, who was believed to be deity, and his lineage also was believed to be deity. So we've got 10 plagues. We've got God. I've described it before as God's coming out party, his welcome party. This is who I am and what I can do. Because I'm a sports guy, this is the illustration that always comes to my head. But in the NBA, they have a draft, right? They have a draft. And if you are good enough at a young age, you'll get drafted to an NBA team. And the first thing they will do is the Dallas Mavericks select your name, right? They'll say the Dallas Mavericks select Luka Doncic, right? And they say your name. Now people know your name. Your name is on the team. Your name is on the roster. Then the season comes around and you have a chance to do what? You got to show what you can do. And if you're a really great player, you have your name called, then you go out there and show, hey, I'm pretty good, right? You go out there and you show what you can do. That's kind of what God did here. He comes to Moses, he comes to Moses, then Moses asks him, then he tells Moses, here's my name. Now watch what I can do. And he goes and proceeds to show his power over absolutely everything. Every god that Egypt could come up with, and everything that is a part of this earth, he shows what he can really do, which is incredible. We have an account of God demonstrating his authority and power over everything on the earth. Last place we're going to go. So number 1, God tells us his name. Number 2, God shows us who he is. Number 3, look at Exodus chapter 32. Let's start in 32. Exodus 32 is the infamous golden calf story. This is when Moses went up on Mount Sinai. He is being given the law by God. And the people are tired of waiting on him up there because he's been up there a long time. And they say, we don't even know what happened to this guy. He could be dead for all we know. He could never be coming down. And for some reason, instead of electing a new leader of the people or determining that someone else should lead them, they say the most logical thing to do here is to melt down all of our gold and make an idol. I don't know how you go from A to B, but somehow they got there. It probably made more sense to them than it does us. So they commission Aaron to fashion them a golden calf. And we've talked about this before. While Moses is up on the mountain, he's receiving the law, and he's receiving some other parts of the covenant that God is about to make with these people, Israel. And there's a lot of language in this passage that describes these 10 commandments as wedding vows. Like there is a covenant between two parties coming together here in Exodus. The equivalent here of what the people are doing is while you're reciting your vows, the other party is breaking the covenant, right? or cheating. This is what the people are doing. God's first commandment was, no other gods before me. And then the people, while God is giving that stipulation of the covenant, the people decide, well, except for this one, right? Like, this one's fine. The audacity. I mean, the visceral response that we would feel if we read a story that went like this with two people getting married. I mean, we would just be outraged. We would be sick about it. We'd be sick for the person who was getting cheated on. This is what's going on in Exodus chapter 32. God is giving Moses stipulations of the covenant. He's telling him, I'm going to make a covenant with my people. We are going to be joined by this covenant. And while it's happening, the people are bailing on him for some other created god that they're about to make out of the gold in their earrings. And so the people down there commission Aaron to fashion a golden calf. He does, and then they have a jolly old time. It says they rose up to play. Sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play in Exodus 32 and verse 6. While this is happening, God says, Moses, get down from here. This is some bad things happened, right? He says some bad things happened. Look at Exodus chapter 33. After the people have committed this sin, Exodus 33, the Lord said to Moses, depart, go up from here, you and the people whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt to the land which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, to your offspring I will give it. And I will send an angel before you, and I will drive out the Canaanites and Amorites and Hittites and Perizzites and Hivites and Jebusites. Go up to a land flowing with milk and honey, but I will not go up among you, lest I consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people. Now this is after Moses has already talked with God about not destroying the people. And God's concession is, okay, I won't destroy the people, but I'm not going with you into the land. And Moses is going to continue to try and intercede on the people's behalf. Like we saw in the second half here of chapter 33, Moses says, it would be better for us to stay in the wilderness with you than to go into the promised land without you. Then you get to Exodus 34, which is where we're going to settle down a little bit. In Exodus 34, Moses is back up on the mountain talking with God, and it starts verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, cut for yourself 2 tablets of stone like the first, and I will write on the tablets words that were on the words that were on the first tablets, which you broke. If you remember, that's what Moses did when he came down from the mountain. He was so angry that the people were doing what they were doing that he broke the 10 commandments and ground up the idol into a powder, put it in water, and made the people drink it. It's weird, but effective. I wouldn't forget that day. So then God says, you're going to make 2 more tablets, and I'm going to write the 10 commandments on them again. Verse 2, be ready by the morning, and come up in the morning to Mount Sinai, and present yourself there to me on the top of the mountain. No one shall come up with you, and let no one be seen throughout all the mountain. Let no flocks or herds graze opposite that mountain. So Moses cut 2 tablets of stone like the first, and he rose early in the morning and went up on Mount Sinai as the Lord had commanded him, and took in his hand 2 tablets of stone. The Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there and proclaimed the name of the Lord. So God came down, stood with Moses, and said his own name. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed. Now, this is where we really need to slow down and read this section. I didn't know this was here for a long, long time. But what we have in these next 2 verses is one of the most incredible things in the whole Bible. Moses is speaking with God. God comes down to speak with him, and this is what he says in verse 6. The Lord passed before Moses and proclaimed, the Lord, the Lord. Now that he says his name twice, which his name is Yahweh. Yahweh, Yahweh, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the 3rd and 4th generation. And Moses quickly bowed his head towards the earth and worshiped. Did you know that God tells us about himself? I'd heard those verses like my whole life. I could have told you to the third and fourth generation, and there are phrases in there, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. Like I knew a lot of those phrases and words, and I'm sure I had read those verses before. I didn't know God was saying them. Isn't that incredible? So we've got God who tells us his name. Then we've got a God who shows us what he can do. And then we have a God who says, tap the brakes. Let me really tell you who I am. Let me tell you about my character. Let me tell you what I'm all about. There is more to me than just my power over all these things that you see, right? There is more to me than just what I did in the 10 plagues. There's more to me than just my name. Let me tell you who I really am. God took the time to get in our hands a book that contains an account of him telling us with his own mouth who he really is. That's unheard of. That's unheard of. That's so different from every other God that they would have heard about. That's so different from any other spiritual being that they would have known. They didn't take the time to tell you about themselves. You figured it out. And if you got it wrong, you were probably going to die. I mean, this is not a God who is off somewhere trying to let us figure out who he is. He's actually here. He came down onto the mountain with Moses and told him out of his mouth, this is who I am. And when you read who this God is, it's incredible. When you read about him, he says about himself, he says, a God who is merciful and gracious. Our God, in his character, wants to show mercy and wants to give grace. That's incredible. That's completely different from any other God of all of the ancient Near East. There wasn't another God who was wanting to be merciful and wanting to be gracious. Then he says that he is slow to anger. Now, there are people, and maybe it's been a thought that's crossed your mind before, that the God of the Old Testament is an angry God. But what does he say about himself? He says he is slow to anger. In fact, what you'll notice is God does not get angry very often, even in the Old Testament. His acts of judgment are often described as remorseful. He's sad about the things that are having to happen. Our God is slow to anger, he's patient. Next thing he says is abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. From what I understand about this phrase, steadfast love, is we have no great translation for what that word is in the Hebrew. We need about 4 different words to understand what this is all about, but steadfast love is one of the best translations that there is. The idea is there is a covenant faithfulness as well as a desire and passion for that is in some translations described as jealousy. The idea behind jealousy is not jealousy like you have something I want, like we typically think of it. Instead, it's more of a jealous spouse, someone who is jealous for, I want my people. I want them with me, not with someone else. That's the idea. A lot of different ideas that come into that, but what a beautiful idea that the God we serve tells us that he is not easy on steadfast love, but abounding in steadfast love and in faithfulness, keeping that steadfast love in verse 7 for thousands. The idea here, from what I understand, is that this is not thousands of people, but thousands of generations. The idea here is that God has a steadfast, jealous, passionate love for thousands of generations. Not just one group of people. And really, the scripture bears out this description that God gives of himself. But he has a steadfast love for thousands of generations of people. And as a result of that, he is, keep reading, forgiving of the iniquity and transgression and sin. I don't remember. I know I've heard my dad do a lesson on this before, so I don't know if it's been here or if it was when I was much younger, but there's a difference between each of these different types of sin, right? Iniquity is one type, transgression is another type, sin is another type, and they all have different, slightly different connotations, different nuance within them. And so the point here, God forgives it all. God forgives it all. He forgives missing the mark. He forgives wrong living. He forgives intentional wrongdoing at times. Like God he is forgiving of iniquity and transgression and sin. And then I don't know if you read this like I do, but it feels to kind of take a turn, doesn't it? You have this incredible description of a gracious, loving, merciful, steadfast, forgiving God. And then the very next verse, it almost seems like the other half of the coin, says, but who will by no means clear the guilty? So he's a just God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. And you hear that and you go, oh, there he is. There's that God of the Old Testament that a lot of people who don't read the Old Testament don't like. That God who's going to punish children for their father's sins and punish grandchildren for their grandfather's sins. There he is. But there's another chunk of the verse that came right before that, isn't there? Two things we need to understand. Number one, if we just go by ratio alone and we take these numbers at face value, God has love for how many generations? Thousands. And he's going to punish or hold accountable how many? 3. 1,000 to 3, loving to punishing. Like, that's a great ratio, okay? That's way better than we deserve, isn't it? He is heavy on the love and forgiveness. That's the God that we serve. That's what he says about himself. The second thing is this phrase, third and fourth generation. We read that and we read Numbers. It's more of a turn of phrase. I couldn't quite think of a great example, so I'm going to give you a really bad example. But when we say someone is the goat, what does that mean? Sometimes when we say it, we'll actually use a picture of a goat and say that they're the goat. Have you seen that before? Well, it's an acronym. It stands for greatest of all time. It can be used in any number of contexts. You might hear the phrase, they're the goat of driving, or they're the goat of picking music, or they're the goat of a sport, right? It just means that someone is really, really good. It actually doesn't even mean that they're the greatest of all time anymore. It just means that they're really, really good at it, right? It's kind of a turn of phrase that in our culture means less than what it seems, and has a meaning that we all understand. Similar thing going on here. In Proverbs chapter 30, we're not going to read it right now, but in Proverbs chapter 30, the author gives a really strange little proverb in verse, I think, 16, 17, and 18. He says, there are 3 things that amaze me. Yes, 4 things I don't understand. The way an eagle flies. And I mean, it's just, there's 4 really interesting things. It's a turn of phrase that is meant not to mean this guy gets everything except for 3 or 4 things. He's not using those numbers literally. He's using them as a turn of phrase. There are things in the world that are beautiful and I don't get, that are hard to grasp and wrap your mind around, right? That's what the proverb writer is saying. It's what Solomon's saying. Same idea here. To the third and fourth generation. It's not like that literally if you sin, your grandkids are going to be paying for it, right? The idea is as many generations as commit these sins, God's going to have to hold them accountable. Whether it be 3 generations that live in that sin or 4 generations that live in that sin, right? God's going to hold every generation accountable that commits these sins against him. Similarly, he's going to forgive thousands of generations. Right? And so when you read that, it's not like God is punishing kids for things that they never did wrong, but the idea, using this turn of phrase, is more of an idea of this is something that anyone who is in that category is going to have to be accountable for their sin because we serve a just God. So rephrase this one more time. We serve a God who told us his name, who showed us what he could do, and then took the time to tell us about his character, to describe himself to us. If someone in a job interview said, could you describe yourself? Well, that's what God just did for us, right? That's awesome. That is awesome. We serve a God who did these 3 things in the book of Exodus to let us know who he is. So 2 things I want to take from that. Number 1, these things are in the Bible, okay? That's really important to know. That's really important to know. When someone says, who is God? I think we should go here pretty quickly, shouldn't we? Well, let me tell you what he says about himself, right? I didn't know that for a long time. These things have got to be in our repertoire of scriptures to be able to go to quickly. Exodus 34, verse 6 and 7. We ought to be able to take people there and show them who our God really is. It's amazing to me that for so long, that question, who is God, was so difficult when this verse has been here for 6,000 years almost? I mean, listen, who is God? The Lord is a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, and forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. That's who our God is. That's who he is. That's what he's all about. And these things are in the Bible for us to know freely. Two implications of that. Number one, we really ought to know that. We really ought to know that. And we ought to be ready to give that answer to people who need to know who our God is. Number two, we have got to teach people that. That ought to be on Bible Study 101. This is who God is. Because that is foundational to understanding who our God is and what he does, and understanding why Jesus was so important. The second thing I think we can really take from this, and it's a really powerful lesson, is that we serve a God who not only, like we've talked about in the past, wants a relationship with us, right? And we've talked about how beautiful that is. But we serve a God who wants to be known by us. That's awesome. We don't serve a God who is off somewhere in a distant realm waiting for us to figure out how to get to him, right? We serve a God who is not far from each one of us, right? We serve a God who is actually desiring for us to know him. Now think about this, because this is a really complex problem. God is other from us. He is radically different and complex, and there are things about God that we will not ever understand because we're limited. But he wants us to know him, and so he has told us who he is, and he's made a way for us to know him. That's incredible. Like, we can know him. We can't know everything about, we all have those when we get to heaven questions, right? But we can know who he is. We can know him enough to trust him. We can know him enough to have a relationship with him. We can know him enough to know what he wants us to do. We can know him enough to know how what the things he values and likes and loves. We can know him enough to know how he's going to act in any given situation. God wants us to know him. That's awesome. We serve a God who wants to be known by us, unlike any other God in the world, including the modern sort of way people say, I'm just spiritual, and they can't define who their God is. We serve a God who wants to be known by us and has chosen to reveal himself to us all throughout the pages of Scripture, all throughout the pages of history, to let us know who he really is. And if we know who God really is, it should both strike fear into our bones and joy into our heart, because he is the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. If we know that God, we then realize a problem, because we have sin that needs to be punished, and he's a just God. And that's when we get to learn about how he remedied that problem through his son, and how he sent his son to die on the cross for our sins so that we could be a part of that first half of the verse, the forgiveness and the graciousness and the faithfulness of God. So tonight, I really want you to take this with you. God told us his name, God showed us his power, and God told us about his character. He is the only God in all of history who has done that for people, because he's the only God in all of history who is real. And that's the God that we serve, a God who desires to be known by us. And as a result of that, he sent his son so that we can be in a relationship with him. So if you need to be in a relationship with God tonight, we can show you more about what his word says about that. Or if you need prayers of the church, we have a public time to come and let that be made known. If we can help you in any way, come while we stand and sing.